December 24, 1994, a Vietnamese diplomat to Algeria, Bui Jung To, boarded Air France Flight 8969, stationed at Houari Boumediene Airport in the capital city of Algiers. He was heading to Paris on a trip for work, along with 223 other passengers. The plane was due to take off at 11:15 a.m., leaving Bui Jung To plenty of time to relax and review any last-minute documents he needed for work. As Bui Jung To is getting ready, 4 figures board the plane. The men are decked out in military police gear, and each carries powerful weapons, including AK-47 rifles, Uzi submachine guns, and grenades. One even has some dynamite on his person. Nothing to fear, however. The men quickly identify themselves as security and begin conducting a passport check among the passengers. This wasn't entirely outside the norm at the time. The country from which this Air France flight is taking off, Algeria, is caught in the midst of a tumultuous civil war. After Algeria gained its independence from the French, political instability gripped the land. The ruling party, the National Liberation Front, had been the driving political force toward independence, but had now lost the support of the people. They voted in favor of the Islamic Salvation Front, a hardline fundamentalist Islamist party, but the military launched a coup d'etat to ensure the ISF never took power. This created a number of splinter groups bent on overthrowing the government. One of these terrorist cells was called the GIA, the Armed Islamic Group of Algeria. The GIA were known for assassinating key figures, kidnapping officials, and never talking to the Algerian government to negotiate truces. Given France supported the ruling Algerian government, their state-owned airline company was considered a vulnerable target for potential terrorist activities. Security was on high alert. As passengers hand over their passports for inspection, one of the men enters the cockpit. Shortly after, a voice sounds through the plane's intercom system. Abdullah Yahya, a former greengrocer, says the following words: "Allah has chosen us to die, and He has chosen you to die with us. Allah guarantees our success." A chill runs down Bui Jung To's spine. The men aren't security inspectors at all, but members of the GIA. They plan to fly all the way to Paris and detonate explosives on board the plane right over the Eiffel Tower, turning what was once a simple flight into a deadly, terrifying attack on the French state, which the terrorists viewed as a foreign invader. This was the situation the passengers of Air France Flight 8969 were facing on the 24th of December 1994. Bui Jung To was the only Vietnamese on board, but the plane held quite an international group of passengers. French, Algerian, German, British, Irish, Norwegian, Dutch, and American citizens were all part of the flight's roster. This hijacking wasn't just an attack on the French or Algerian governments. It was turning into a major international crisis. The GIA members had come prepared. They rigged 2 sets of dynamite inside the plane, one in the cockpit and the other under one of the passengers' seats, and linked them together with detonator wire. Should the Algerian government not meet the terrorists' demands and allow them to fly the plane out of Algiers, they would destroy the entire aircraft and kill everyone on board. On top of this, the hijackers swap uniforms with pilots and crew members so as to confuse any potential snipers. One of the attackers, a man by the name of Lofty, even demanded that the passengers separate themselves based on gender and that the women all cover their hair. When the clock strikes 11:15 a.m. and the plane still hasn't taken off, airport officials start to grow suspicious. They send personnel to investigate and learn of what has transpired. A negotiator from the Algerian government arrives on the scene. the group demands that 2 prisoners of the Algerian government be released: Abbasi Madani and Ali Balhaj, 2 leaders of the Islamic Salvation Front. The government, however, doesn't give in to their demands. When the terrorists ask for the air stairs to be removed so that the plane can take off towards Paris, the Algerians refuse and demand the group release any children on board. A stalemate ensues. The hijackers grow increasingly frustrated. They shoot and kill an Algerian law enforcement officer who was on board. Despite this, the government still doesn't budge on their stance. Feeling cornered, the attackers turn to Bui Jungto. They point their guns at the man and order him to move towards the plane's exit. The Vietnamese diplomat's life was about to end. Much to everyone's shock, Bui Jungto shows no fear. He doesn't let himself be intimidated for even a moment and calmly steps towards the door. The terrorists are livid at the courage the 48-year-old shows in the face of death. One fires his weapon. Bui Jungto drops to the floor, dead. From this moment on, the hijacking turns from a developing incident to a full-blown international hostage crisis. The entire world watches on. Word soon reached the French Prime Minister, Edouard Balladur, that a large number of French citizens were being held hostage on an Air France vessel in Algeria. One might wonder why the French government had decided to continue sending planes to a country engulfed in a civil war. But the idea was to demonstrate continued political support to the ruling regime. The situation was tricky to say the least. On the one hand, France didn't want to tread on the toes of the Algerians as they tried to handle the situation. On the other, the murder of a Vietnamese diplomat meant the terrorists were making it clear they wouldn't hesitate to kill foreign nationals. France advised Algeria to let the plane take off and fly to a nearby European airport, where the authorities would be in a better position to rescue the hostages. As the plane wasn't at full fuel capacity, the terrorists would never be able to reach Paris without stopping somewhere. The French suggested Majorca, a Spanish island. The Algerians, however, insisted that they were capable of keeping the situation under control. The plane stayed grounded. Back on the plane, a flight attendant was allowed entry into the cockpit to ask the pilots if they needed anything. The pilot, 51-year-old Bernard Delhem, told the crew member that the terrorists had already killed 2 passengers, the law enforcement agent and Bui Jungto. Word spreads across the plane, and tension begins to rise. The longer this draws on, the less sure people are that they'll be leaving the plane alive. A tense calm washes over the cabin. Come Christmas Day, 1994, 24 hours after the initial takeover, a breakthrough was made in negotiations. Women accompanying small children were allowed off the plane, bringing 63 passengers to safety. The Algerians decide to build on their momentum by bringing Abdullah Yahia's mother to the airport. It's a critical mistake. Yahia goes into a blind rage upon hearing his mother's voice. He lashes out at the passengers and demands a French citizen be brought to the front of the plane. Yannick Bounier, an employee of the French embassy in Algiers, is pushed out of the exit and shot dead. The killing of a 3rd passenger, this time a French national, changes the entire situation. The French come down hard on the Algerians. They say they will hold the Algerian government responsible should any more French lives be lost, and demand they hand over control of the situation. Facing the potential loss of their strongest international ally, the Algerians finally conceded and let the terrorists fly the plane out of the airport. During this time, the GIGN, French Special Forces, have been preparing. They use a replica similar to the plane's model to train for the boarding and clearing of Flight 8969. The terrorists are flying towards Marseille-Provence Airport where they've agreed to refuel en route to Paris. Unbeknownst to them, a crack team of elite operatives under the command of Denis Favier. On Boxing Day, the plane landed and the French Special Forces operatives took their positions. The world watched, hearts racing, wondering if the terrorists would succeed in detonating the plane over the Eiffel Tower. The French government made it clear, however, no matter the cost, Flight 8969 was not leaving the runway. By now, the French authorities had been clued into the hijackers' intentions. The released passengers back in Algiers had informed police of the dynamite stuck inside the cockpit and under one of the seats. Allowing the plane to leave the airport would result in not just the deaths of everyone on board, but would also lead to a devastating terrorist attack on the country's chief symbolic landmark. At 8:00 a.m., food and water were delivered to the passengers inside Flight 8969 by airport staff members, or so the hijackers believed. In reality, GIGN operatives disguised themselves as staff and used the opportunity to map out the inside of the plane and get an idea of where the passengers were being held. While the terrorists weren't watching, the operatives also planted audio devices to listen in on any conversations held inside the cabin. Most important of all, they discovered that none of the doors had been booby-trapped or locked. Entry into the plane was clear and safe. French negotiators requested the front of the plane be cleared so as to create a zone where the terrorists could hold a press conference. In reality, the French were looking to make a secure space where they knew no passengers would be in harm's way. Denis Favier's team readied itself for the mission. Snipers are placed on the top of nearby radio towers for a clearer shot, and the Special Forces team takes its positions. At 5 p.m., Abdullah Yahya becomes increasingly frustrated by the delays and orders that another passenger be executed. Quran passages that were reserved for funeral rites began to play over the plane's intercom. The passengers started to panic. The French hear this order through the listening devices and spring to action. GIGN officers storm the plane. Getting the 3 air stairs up to the door is troublesome at first, as the model the team practiced with had a different height, but they eventually succeed. The first shots are fired at the terrorists. One of them is shot dead instantly, while his 3 accomplices return fire. Smoke fills the inside of the plane as concussion grenades and flashbangs are tossed inside. Passengers hit the deck and put their hands over their heads. A vortex of hellish gunfire and panic engulfs the entire plane. In the cockpit, co-pilot Jean-Paul Brodier climbs out of the window and lands on the airport runway. The fall breaks his femur, but the adrenaline coursing through his body allows him to run to safety. Thanks to his brave actions, Brodier gives the snipers an unobstructed view of one of the hijackers. They open fire. A second and third terrorist are killed. The majority of passengers have been escorted to safety now, but the pilot, Bernard Delhem, and his flight engineer are still locked inside with the last hijacker. Cornered and outnumbered, it's clear to everyone in the situation that the man isn't walking off the plane alive. Delhem fears that the hijacker will kill his 2 captives out of spite. For whatever reason, the man shows them mercy. He holds off the remaining GIGN forces for 20 minutes, firing into one officer's cartridges and causing them to explode, sending him tumbling down the air stairs. When he finally runs out of ammo, he's shot dead, and the remaining hostages are rescued. After 54 hours of intense, panic-inducing action, the incident is finally brought to a close. The French Prime Minister heaps tons of praise on the operatives for carrying out a successful raid and preventing any further casualties. All in all, 30 are injured and 3 passengers are dead. Considering how fragile the hostage situation had become, it could have gone a lot worse. The GIGN team, as well as the negotiation team and cabin crew, who stalled for vital time, were heralded as heroes by the French public, and the entire response became a standard case study on how to handle such hostage situations. Seeing how well the French responded to their attack, the GIA never attempted another hijacking. While the operation to rescue the passengers was primarily a resounding success, the incident still left the public shaken. Many began to wonder whether France should continue flying planes out of Algiers, and some even asked for the government to no longer support the Algerian government for fear of a repeat incident. Despite the fears, Air France continued flying to the Algerian capital, though the plane was scrapped after the incident. Still, the attack showed just how vulnerable airlines were to planned terrorist attacks. It wouldn't be until the 11th of September 2001, 7 years later, that the world would truly understand this harsh lesson.